What if the people sworn to protect you were the ones pulling the strings? In a small southern town, corruption isn't just hidden, it's the law. Every crime covered up, every voice silenced, until they made one mistake. They came after the wrong man. Isaiah Carter, a former Navy SEAL turned small business owner, wanted a quiet life, but when the police tried to frame him, he uncovered something bigger, an empire of power, fear, and control. Now, he's not just fighting for himself. He's taking on a system that was never meant to be challenged. And once the truth comes out, there's no turning back. Stay with me. This story is just getting started. Isaiah Carter had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best weapon. In his years as a Navy SEAL, he had navigated hostile terrain, survived ambushes, and dismantled networks of men who thought they were untouchable. Now, in the quiet town of Pinevale, he was testing a different kind of battlefield. The kind where danger didn't come with flashing muzzles but in whispered threats and knowing glances. It had been nearly 3 years since he left that life behind. Trading tactical gear for a cash register, combat boots for worn-in sneakers. He liked the simplicity of it, stocking shelves, chatting with customers, closing up at sundown. His liquor store sat on a quiet street lined with mom-and-pop businesses. The kind that had been here for decades. Some folks in town saw him as an outsider, but he didn't mind. He had no intention of stirring trouble. Yet, trouble had a way of finding him. That afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk outside, the door chime jingled. Isaiah looked up from the counter to see 2 uniformed officers stepping inside. Sergeant Mark Redding led the way. He moved like a man who expected the world to step aside for him, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, eyes cold with authority. Behind him, Officer Owen Briggs followed, shorter but wiry, his presence buzzing with nervous energy. They weren't here for liquor. Isaiah wiped his hands on a rag and leaned casually against the counter. Afternoon, officers. Something I can help you with? Redding took his time glancing around the shop, his fingers grazing a shelf of whiskey bottles as if inspecting the merchandise. He didn't look at Isaiah when he spoke. Heard you're doing good business here, Carter. Isaiah studied him, waiting. He had seen this before. Men in uniform using pleasantries as a prelude to something darker. Briggs took a step closer. Town like this, it's important to keep things running smooth. Businesses like yours, they can run into trouble if they don't have the right kind of protection. Isaiah exhaled slowly. There it was. Redding finally turned his gaze on him, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You seem like a smart man. You understand how things work. Isaiah met his eyes, steady and unyielding. I understand just fine. A beat of silence. Then, Redding's smile faded. Then you know what happens when people stop understanding. Isaiah didn't flinch. I'm not interested. Briggs let out a short laugh. But it lacked humor. That's the thing, Carter. This isn't about interest. It's about making sure you don't have any unfortunate incidents. Isaiah folded his arms. Like what? Redding stepped closer, his voice a notch lower. Vandalism, accidents, break-ins. This town isn't always safe. You know. Isaiah felt his jaw tighten. But he kept his face impassive. He could already see where this was going. A demand wrapped in a warning. A test to see if he would cave. But Isaiah Carter wasn't the kind of man who folded. I appreciate the concern, he said evenly, but I take care of my own business. Redding held his stare a moment longer, then nodded, as if filing away the response for later. He turned toward the door. We'll check in again soon. Let us know if you change your mind. Briggs flashed a grin, the kind that promised things would get worse before they got better. Then, they were gone. The door swung shut behind them, but the weight of their presence lingered. Isaiah stood motionless for a moment, letting his heartbeat settle. Then, slowly, he scanned the shop. A few customers had been browsing the shelves, but now they kept their heads down, avoiding his gaze, except for one. A man near the back of the store, mid-40s, dark skin, dressed in a work jacket, watched Isaiah carefully. When their eyes met, the man gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. A warning. Isaiah exhaled. So this was how things worked in Pinevale. The question was, how far were these men willing to go? That night, long after he had closed up shop, He sat in his apartment above the store, drinking a beer in the dim glow of the kitchen light. The town was quiet at this hour. Peaceful, or so it seemed. When he glanced out the window, he saw it, parked just a block down, partially obscured by a street lamp. A squad car idled with its lights off. Watching, Isaiah let the curtain fall back into place. It seemed like the test wasn't over yet. Isaiah Carter had always trusted his instincts. And this morning, they screamed that something was wrong. He woke up to an eerie stillness. Normally, Pinevale stirred to life early, delivery trucks rattling down the main road, the distant hum of radios from the diner across the street. But today, the air felt too quiet, like the town was holding its breath. When he reached the bottom of the stairs leading to his shop, the sight stopped him cold. Shattered glass crunched beneath his boots. The front window of his liquor store was obliterated, jagged shards still clinging to the frame. Shelves had been overturned, bottles smashed against the floor, their contents pooling into sticky, amber-colored puddles. The cash register sat open, untouched. A clear message that this wasn't a robbery. Isaiah didn't move at first. He let his eyes scan the destruction, taking in every detail. This wasn't random vandalism. It was controlled, deliberate. Whoever did this wanted him to know exactly why. His jaw clenched, but he forced himself to breathe. He had expected retaliation, just not this soon. The sharp wail of sirens cut through the air. His gaze flicked toward the street just as two squad cars pulled up. Isaiah had seen enough staged crime scenes in his time to recognize one now. Sergeant Mark Redding stepped out first, a smirk already tugging at his mouth. Behind him, Officer Owen Briggs moved toward the entrance, his expression unreadable. Isaiah didn't bother greeting them. Redding took his time surveying the damage, hands resting on his belt like he had all the time in the world. "Damn shame," he muttered. "Looks like someone doesn't like you much, Carter." Isaiah leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "That so?" Briggs had wandered toward a fallen shelf near the counter. He crouched, moving aside a broken bottle, then glanced up with feigned surprise. "Well, would you look at that?" Isaiah knew before Briggs even lifted the evidence what was coming. The officer held up a small plastic bag, the white powder inside unmistakable. Redding let out a low whistle. "Now, that's real unfortunate." Isaiah exhaled through his nose. He had expected intimidation, maybe another visit, but planting drugs? That meant they weren't just trying to scare him anymore. They were setting him up. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance," Briggs announced. The words practiced, routine. Isaiah didn't resist when they cuffed him. There was no point, not yet. As they led him outside, a few bystanders lingered at a distance. Some turned away quickly, pretending they hadn't seen anything. Others, mostly business owners like him, exchanged uneasy glances. One person held his gaze longer than the rest. A woman, standing near the entrance of a cafe across the street. She had a barista's apron tied around her waist, dark curls pulled into a loose bun. Samantha Green. Isaiah saw something in her eyes that he recognized, fear, but not surprise. He didn't get the chance to process it before he was shoved into the back of the squad car. The ride to the station was slow, intentional. Isaiah stared out the window, watching Pinevale roll past in a blur of muted colors. He knew exactly what this was. A power play. At the station, the heavy door buzzed open, and Isaiah was led down a fluorescent-lit hallway. Officers barely looked up as he passed. This wasn't a rare occurrence here. When they stopped outside an office, Redding yanked the door open and gestured him inside. The room smelled like stale coffee and old leather. A desk sat near the center, cluttered with case files and a nameplate that read Chief Jonas Keating. Keating was an older man, but the weight of authority sat heavy on him. His uniform was crisp, his presence commanding. Unlike Redding, he didn't bother with smirks or empty threats. He let the silence do the work. Finally, he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "I don't think you understand where you are, Carter." Isaiah held his stare. "Seems pretty clear to me." Keating smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've seen men like you before. You think because you've been in the dirt, because you've fought your wars, that makes you untouchable." He shook his head slightly. "This town doesn't work like that." Isaiah didn't blink. Keating exhaled slowly. You have a choice. You can cooperate, keep your business, live your life, or, he gestured vaguely, you can keep fighting and see how that works out for you. Isaiah said nothing. Keating studied him, then sat back, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. You're going to learn, Carter. Sooner or later, everybody does. With that, Redding pulled Isaiah to his feet. Booking time. Isaiah was led down another hallway, past holding cells. He barely noticed the other inmates, too focused on what had just transpired. Then, as they passed a particular cell, a quiet voice cut through the noise. They won't stop. Isaiah turned. Samantha Green sat on a bench inside, hands clasped in her lap. She looked exhausted, but there was something else in her eyes. A warning. Before Isaiah could respond, Redding yanked him forward. As the heavy metal door clanked shut behind him, Isaiah knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Isaiah sat in the cold, windowless room, hands still cuffed in front of him. The fluorescent light above hummed softly, flickering every few seconds, adding to the stale, artificial air of the space. The walls were bare except for a large one-way mirror opposite him. The kind meant to remind people they were being watched, even in silence. He had spent years in rooms like this before, on the other side. Asking the questions, he knew how these things worked. The metal door creaked open, and Sergeant Mark Redding stepped inside, followed closely by Chief Jonas Keating. Isaiah didn't miss the way Keating took his time closing the door, rolling his sleeves up just enough to suggest a man settling in. Redding dragged a chair across the floor and dropped into it, leaning forward, elbows on the table. His smirk was the same as earlier, full of the kind of confidence that only came with power unchecked. Keating remained standing, his presence filling the space without a word. He was older than Redding, but that didn't make him any less dangerous. If anything, it meant he had played this game long enough to never get his hands dirty himself. Isaiah met their gazes evenly, waiting. Keating sighed as if this were all a mild inconvenience. You've made things difficult for yourself, Carter. Isaiah tilted his head slightly. Is that so? Redding chuckled, shaking his head. You don't seem too concerned. I'm not. Keating pulled out the chair across from Isaiah and sat down, smoothing out the front of his uniform. You're a smart man, Carter. You know how the world works. Some people, he gestured vaguely, they understand the rules and live just fine. Others think they're above them. Isaiah didn't respond. Keating leaned in. You got two options here. One is easy. He folded his hands together. You pay a small fine. We forget about this whole mess. And you go back to running your little store. Isaiah let the silence stretch before speaking. And if I don't? Keating gave a slow, disappointed shake of his head. Then you become another statistic. A man with a record. Maybe this time, it's possession. Next time, it's resisting arrest. Maybe worse. And soon enough, you find yourself in a place where nobody cares what's true. Redding tapped a finger on the table. We're offering you a way out. Take it. Isaiah smiled, but there was no amusement in it. See, that's the problem with guys like you. You think you're offering a deal, but all I hear is a threat. Keating's expression darkened just slightly. It's not a threat, Carter. It's reality. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, stretching his shoulders. Here's mine. You go to hell. Redding let out a low chuckle. Suit yourself. Keating stood, adjusting his uniform with an air of finality. You're making a mistake. Isaiah didn't answer. Redding rapped his knuckles against the table. Guess you're spending the night. Then, Isaiah watched them leave, the door slamming shut behind them. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. They wanted him rattled. They wanted him scared enough to fold. It wasn't going to happen. Hours passed, maybe more. No clock in the room. No way to track time beyond the occasional shifting of footsteps in the hallway. Isaiah forced himself to stay still, to breathe slow, to keep his mind sharp. Then, in the silence, something unexpected. A rustle of paper. He glanced down, on the table, just beneath his cuffed hands. A small slip of paper peeked out from the edge of a booking form. His eyes flicked toward the door. No movement. Carefully, he shifted his fingers, pulling the paper into view. The handwriting was small, hurried. Stay quiet, but watch. Someone wants to help you. He didn't react, didn't so much as blink. But his mind was already working. Who? And more importantly, why? The door finally opened again. This time with two officers who said nothing as they led him to a holding cell. He was shoved inside, the bars clanking shut behind him. Isaiah sat on the hard bench, eyes scanning the room. He wasn't alone. A few other detainees slumped against the walls, heads down, but it was one person in particular who caught his attention. A woman, leaning against the far end of the cell. Samantha Green. She looked up, met his gaze, and gave a tired, knowing smile. Isaiah's pulse slowed. Steady. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Isaiah stepped out of the station, the morning sun casting long shadows on the pavement. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the distant scent of fresh coffee from the diner down the street. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the stiffness from a night spent in a cold cell. He had barely taken 2 steps when a woman's voice stopped him. "You must be Isaiah Carter." He turned. A woman in a sharp navy blue suit stood near the curb, one hand in her pocket, the other holding a worn leather briefcase. She was in her late 30s, tall, confident, with a presence that didn't belong in a town like Pinevale. "And you are?" he asked, studying her. "Laura Weston," she said, offering a small, knowing smile. "Your lawyer." Isaiah frowned. "I don't have a lawyer." She arched a brow. "You do now. Someone thought you might need one." Isaiah had spent enough time around people who played both sides to know that trust wasn't given, it was earned. He kept his expression neutral. "Who sent you?" Laura hesitated, just for a second. "A friend." That wasn't an answer, but Isaiah let it slide. "I assume you didn't come all the way out here just to shake my hand." Laura gestured toward a bench near the sidewalk. "Walk with me." He followed her, keeping his steps measured. Pinevale was a town where people noticed things. 2 figures talking outside the police station would spark curiosity. And he wasn't in the mood for more unwanted attention. As they walked, Laura spoke in a low, deliberate voice. "I've been tracking cases like yours for a while. Small business owners, mostly Black and Latino, being targeted under false charges. Vandalism, drug possession, tax fraud. The pattern is always the same. Local police manufacture a crime. The business owners lose their livelihood, and someone swoops in to buy the property for pennies on the dollar." Isaiah listened, his jaw tightening. "And let me guess, those properties don't stay empty for long." Laura nodded. "Pinevale is just one of many places where this has happened. The difference is, most people take the deal when it's offered. They cut their losses and leave." She turned to look at him. "You didn't." Isaiah exhaled through his nose. "I don't scare easy. That's why you're a problem," Laura said simply. "And problems get removed." Isaiah let that sink in. This wasn't about him. Not really. It was about control. About making sure no one thought they could stand up to the system that had been built here. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Laura gave him a wry smile. "Let's just say I've dealt with men like Keating and Redding before. This isn't my first fight." He studied her again, this time with a little more interest. She wasn't just here on some noble crusade. There was history behind her words. Something personal. He could respect that. Before he could ask more, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw an unknown number. "Answer it," Laura said. Isaiah hesitated before pressing the call button. "Yeah? It's Samantha." His grip tightened on the phone. "Where are you?" "Not safe," she whispered. "I think they're watching me." A wave of tension rippled through him. "Stay put. I'm coming." He hung up and turned to Laura. "I need a ride." She didn't ask questions. "Let's go." Samantha's cafe was a few blocks away. A small place tucked between a laundromat and a thrift store. The sign above the door read Green Bean Cafe. But the neon light in the second word flickered, half burnt out. Isaiah stepped inside, the scent of roasted coffee thick in the air. Samantha was behind the counter, her face pale, hands gripping a dish towel so tightly her knuckles were white. "You alone?" Isaiah asked. She nodded, eyes darting toward the front window. "They came by last night. Just parked outside. Didn't say anything. Didn't have to." Laura moved to the door, checking the street. Isaiah leaned in closer. "What else?" Samantha swallowed hard. "I tried to report Redding months ago. Took everything to internal affairs. But my file? It disappeared. The witness who agreed to speak suddenly changed his mind. And me? She let out a bitter laugh. They pinned a health violation on me. Shut me down for 2 weeks. When that didn't work, someone slashed my tires. It was a warning. Isaiah felt his fists clench. He had seen intimidation tactics before. They were efficient, subtle enough to leave just enough doubt, but clear enough to send a message. We need proof, Laura said from across the room. Something solid. Isaiah's mind worked fast. The security cameras at my store. If they planted that bag, it had to be caught on video. Samantha looked hesitant. If the footage is still there. Isaiah didn't let himself think about that possibility. There's only one way to find out. Back at his store, the damage from the break-in was still there. Glass crunching under their shoes as they moved. Isaiah crouched behind the counter, yanking open the panel beneath the register. His security system wasn't state-of-the-art, but it got the job done. He tapped a few keys, scrolling through footage. Then he found it. The screen showed Redding and Briggs entering the store the night before. The timestamp confirmed it. Long before Isaiah had woken up to find the place trashed. Isaiah's breath slowed as he watched Redding crouch behind the counter, pulling something from his pocket. A small plastic bag. He placed it on the floor, then stood, dusting off his hands like nothing had happened. There, Isaiah said. Laura leaned in. That's enough to prove they planted evidence. Isaiah nodded, muscles coiled tight. We take this to the press. An hour later, they arrived at the office of the Pinevale Tribune. The small newspaper building sat on a quiet street, its faded sign barely visible under years of dust and neglect. Isaiah pushed the door open. Stepping inside, he expected the hum of an old newsroom, the click of keyboards, the smell of ink and coffee. Instead, he found chaos. Desks overturned, filing cabinets yanked open, their contents spilled onto the floor. A shattered lamp in the corner. The air smelled of stale paper and something else. Something burnt. Laura stepped past him, eyes scanning the wreckage. Someone got here first, she said quietly. Isaiah exhaled, slow and steady. This wasn't just about him anymore. Someone wanted to make sure the truth never got out. Chapter 5. The system strikes back. Isaiah stood in the wreckage of the newsroom, the stale air thick with the scent of burnt paper and dust. His jaw tightened as he scanned the room, drawers yanked open, desks overturned, a shattered lamp in the corner. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. Laura bent down near a pile of scattered documents, picking up a torn sheet. The ink had smudged, but the headline was still legible. Local business owner targeted in drug scandal. Corruption allegations surface. Isaiah exhaled through his nose. The article had never made it to print. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to scare the journalist. They wanted to erase the story entirely. Laura straightened, shaking her head. This isn't just about silencing one voice. They're making sure no one else even tries to speak. Isaiah knew she was right. The people running this town weren't just bullies with badges. They were part of a system that had been in place for years, protecting itself from the inside out. And now, that system had turned its full attention on him. They needed a new plan, a safer way to move forward. For now, he had to disappear. 2 hours later, Isaiah and Laura sat in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of Pinevale. The place had been around for decades. The kind of spot where regulars sat in the same booths every morning. Where the coffee was always a little burnt but nobody cared. Laura tapped her fingers against the table, deep in thought. I have a contact in the Justice Department, she said finally. Internal Affairs. He's been looking into cases like this for a while. Isaiah met her gaze. Someone we can trust? Laura hesitated, then nodded. Marcus Hensley. He's one of the good ones. But if we reach out, we need to be careful. If Redding and Keating find out we're talking to him, they'll come at you even harder. Isaiah leaned back, rubbing his jaw. They're already all in. At this point, there's no holding back. Laura pulled out her phone, typing quickly. I'll set up a meeting. The next evening, Isaiah found himself in a parking garage on the north side of town. The concrete walls damp from the humidity. The hum of a distant street lamp was the only sound in the still air. A sedan pulled up, headlights cutting through the shadows. The driver stepped out, a black man in his late 40s. Dressed in a plain suit, His posture was calm, but there was something in his eyes that said he'd seen the worst of people. Marcus Hensley. He walked toward them, keeping his voice low. You're making enemies in all the wrong places. Carter. Isaiah folded his arms. I figured that out already. Hensley studied him for a moment before speaking. Pinevale's been dirty for years. Every attempt to investigate gets shut down before it even starts. Officers protect each other. Witnesses back out. Evidence disappears. And now, they've set their sights on you. Isaiah nodded toward Laura. She said you've been looking into this. Hensley sighed. I've had my suspicions, but nothing concrete. Your case changes that. Laura crossed her arms. So what now? Hensley glanced around the garage, his voice dropping lower. Now, you lay low, because if you keep pushing, they'll find another way to take you down. Isaiah shook his head. Laying low isn't an option. Hensley exhaled sharply. Then watch your back, because they're already moving against you. That night, Isaiah returned to his store, his gut tight with unease. The street was quiet, too quiet. As he stepped inside, he knew instantly that something was off. The air felt heavier. There was no sign of forced entry. But that didn't mean anything. His eyes swept the room. Nothing was missing, nothing overturned. But then he saw it. A single bullet sat on the counter, gleaming under the fluorescent light. Not a threat, a promise. His pulse slowed, controlled. He picked up the bullet, rolling it between his fingers. They wanted him to know they could reach him anytime they wanted. He set it down carefully. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. A single text. Where's Samantha? The words sent a chill through him. He tried calling. No answer. His mind moved fast, pulling up the last time he had seen her. She had been worried, nervous, but she had still been there. Now, she wasn't. His fists clenched. They had taken her, and they expected him to do nothing. They were wrong. Isaiah stood in the dim glow of his apartment, the weight of the past few days pressing heavy on his shoulders. The single bullet left on his counter had been a warning. Samantha's disappearance was a promise. They were done playing games. He gripped his phone, scrolling through his last call with her. No answer, no messages, just silence. Laura's voice cut through his thoughts. We need to find her fast. He looked up. She was standing near the window, arms crossed. Her usual composed expression was laced with something else. Concern. Hensley's trying to pull some strings. But there's only so much he can do from the outside. She continued. If she's in police custody, there won't be a record. They won't make it official. Isaiah nodded slowly. That means they took her somewhere off the books. Laura exhaled. Any ideas where? Isaiah had spent years hunting people who didn't want to be found. He knew how to track movement, how to follow digital breadcrumbs. He just needed a place to start. The traffic cams, he said. If they moved her in a vehicle, we can trace it. Laura's brow furrowed. And how exactly do you plan on getting access to those? Isaiah reached for his jacket. I know a guy. An hour later, they sat in the back of a dimly lit tech repair shop. The smell of burnt circuits lingering in the air. Across from them, a man hunched over a laptop, fingers flying over the keys. Javier Cruz had made a name for himself as the kind of guy who could find anything. For a price. Isaiah had helped him once. A long time ago. And now it was time to call in a favor. Javier squinted at the screen, chewing the end of a pen. You're lucky I owe you. He muttered. This isn't exactly legal. Isaiah remained silent, watching as the screen flickered with a series of camera feeds from around Pinevale. Javier tapped a few keys, rewinding footage. There, he pointed. Black SUV, tinted windows, no plates. The timestamp put the vehicle on the road less than an hour after Samantha had last called Isaiah. Laura leaned in. Where were they headed? Javier followed the route, pulling up another camera feed from the outskirts of town. The SUV turned off the main road, disappearing down a narrow dirt path. Isaiah's stomach tightened. He recognized that area. The old shipping warehouse. He muttered. Laura frowned. You think they took her there? Isaiah's jaw set. I don't think. I know. They arrived at the warehouse just after midnight. The air thick with the scent of oil and rust. The building loomed in the darkness, its metal siding worn from years of neglect. Isaiah moved carefully, keeping to the shadows. Laura followed a few steps behind, her breath steady. Before they reached the entrance, a figure stepped out from the side of the building. Deputy Marisol Grant. Isaiah tensed, ready for a fight, but she raised a hand, glancing over her shoulder before whispering, "If you're going to do something, do it now. They won't keep her much longer." Isaiah studied her. "Why are you helping us?" Marisol's expression was unreadable. "Just move fast." That was all the confirmation he needed. He slipped through a broken side door, keeping low. Inside, the warehouse was mostly empty. Stacks of old shipping crates lining the walls. In the center of the space, under the dim glow of a single overhead light, Samantha sat tied to a chair. Redding stood in front of her, arms crossed, while Briggs paced nearby. Isaiah moved closer, listening. "You know how this ends," Redding was saying. "Say the word, and we let you go." Samantha's voice was weak but defiant. "Go to hell." Briggs let out a frustrated sigh. "We should just be done with this." Redding shook his head. "No. We need her to take it back." Isaiah had heard enough. He moved swiftly, catching Briggs first. A quick strike to the back of the head sent the officer crumpling to the floor. Redding spun, reaching for his gun, but Isaiah was faster. He grabbed the sergeant's wrist, twisting hard until the weapon clattered to the ground. The fight was brutal, neither man holding back. Redding was strong, but Isaiah had the advantage of experience. Within seconds, Redding was on the ground, groaning in pain. Isaiah didn't waste time. He rushed to Samantha, cutting the ropes around her wrists. She winced, her face pale. "Took you long enough." Isaiah gave her a quick once-over. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though she was clearly in pain. "Let's get the hell out of here." They made it outside, Laura helping Samantha toward the car. Isaiah moved to follow but hesitated. Something wasn't right. He turned back, scanning the warehouse. Then he saw it. A small, unmarked filing cabinet near Redding's desk. He moved fast, yanking open the top drawer. Inside, among stacks of papers, a flash drive sat taped to the underside of the drawer. He grabbed it without hesitation. If Redding had kept something off the books, this was it. 15 minutes later, they were on the road. Samantha resting in the backseat, Laura at the wheel. Isaiah turned the flash drive over in his fingers. "What do you think is on it?" Laura asked. Isaiah exhaled slowly. "Answers. And maybe, just maybe, the key to bringing them all down." Isaiah sat in the dimly lit motel room, his eyes locked on the laptop screen. The USB drive rested beside him, a small piece of plastic and metal that had the power to bring down an empire of corruption. He had spent years gathering intelligence in hostile territories, but nothing had ever felt as dangerous as what he was about to uncover. Laura sat across from him, arms folded, her expression tense. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Isaiah inserted the USB and watched as a series of encrypted folders appeared. With a few keystrokes, Laura bypassed the security. Lines of text and spreadsheets filled the screen. The first document listed names, officers, business owners, local officials, a network of corruption carefully hidden behind legitimate transactions. Isaiah's stomach tightened as he scrolled. Mark Redding, Owen Briggs, Jonas Keating, and beneath their names, something worse. Connections to state officials, real estate developers, and unmarked accounts moving millions of dollars. Laura leaned in, scanning the numbers. They're not just shaking down small businesses. They're laundering money through them. Property is seized under false charges, sold at a fraction of its value, then funneled through shell companies before ending up in private hands. Isaiah clenched his jaw, and Keating's at the center of it. Laura nodded, and he's not working alone. A separate file contained transaction records, payments wired offshore, real estate deals linked to dummy corporations. This wasn't just about Pinevale. It was bigger. Isaiah exhaled slowly. This is enough to bring them down. Laura frowned. If we play it right. Isaiah's instinct was to go public, to expose everything before Keating had a chance to cover his tracks. But Laura hesitated. If we move too fast, they'll bury this before it ever sees daylight. She warned. Keating has people in high places. We need to make sure this lands somewhere they can't touch. Isaiah leaned back, processing. FBI? Laura nodded. I know someone inside. Marcus Hensley. He's been after Keating for years but never had enough to pin him. This might change that. That night, Isaiah and Laura met Hensley in a secure location, an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The irony not lost on any of them. Hensley plugged the USB into his laptop, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled through the evidence. After a long moment, he looked up. This is big, he admitted, but not enough to make arrests. Keating's got layers of insulation. He'll say he had no knowledge of any of this. Isaiah's frustration flared. So what? We sit on it? Hensley shook his head. No, but if you release this now, without the right backing, it'll disappear. Keating will call in favors. Shut it down, and you'll be the ones hunted for spreading false allegations. Laura exhaled. So what do we do? Hensley hesitated. You need a witness. Someone on the inside who can verify this. Isaiah's mind turned to Marisol Grant. She had helped him before. If she was willing to come forward. Before he could speak, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. He answered cautiously. A voice whispered through the line. You're being watched. Isaiah stiffened. Marisol? Keating knows about the USB. She murmured. He's already moving against you. Get out, now. The line went dead. Isaiah turned to Laura. We need to leave, now. She didn't ask questions. She grabbed the laptop, stuffed the USB back into Isaiah's pocket, and headed for the door. The moment they stepped outside, headlights flooded the alley. A black SUV skidded to a stop. Doors flew open. Armed men poured out. Isaiah grabbed Laura's wrist and ran. Bullets ricocheted off brick as they sprinted through the alley, their shadows stretching under the flickering streetlights. Laura ducked behind a dumpster, panting. They're not arresting us, she said between breaths. They're taking us out. Isaiah scanned the area, searching for an escape route. The only option was up. He pointed to a fire escape. Go. Laura climbed first, her hands gripping the cold metal rungs. Isaiah followed, bullets tearing into the rusted staircase beneath him. They reached the rooftop, running across the gravel surface. The SUV screeched below, men shouting orders into radios. Isaiah spotted another building a few feet away. The gap was wide, but not impossible. He turned to Laura. Jump. Her eyes widened. Are you serious? Isaiah didn't wait. He took off, his legs propelling him forward. His feet barely caught the edge of the next roof. He rolled, absorbing the impact, then turned back. Your turn. Laura hesitated for only a second before leaping. Isaiah caught her arm, pulling her onto the rooftop just as more shots rang out. They disappeared into the night, leaving their attackers behind. But Isaiah knew the chase wasn't over. They were officially out of time. The motel room was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of Laura's fingers against her laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, eyes sharp with concentration. Across from her, Isaiah leaned forward, studying the numbers on the screen. The USB had given them more than just names and shady real estate deals. It had revealed something much larger. A single offshore account, hundreds of thousands of dollars wired in increments, all leading back to one name. Jonas Keating. Isaiah exhaled slowly. Keating isn't just protecting these guys. He's financing the whole operation. Laura nodded, her expression grim. He's got his hands in everything. The police force, city contracts, even state-level politicians. That's why every attempt to investigate Pinevale's corruption has gone nowhere. They were never just protecting themselves. They were protecting him. Isaiah had suspected Keating was more than just a corrupt police chief. But this confirmed it. He wasn't just running a small-town racket, he was playing a much bigger game. Laura scrolled through the documents. Most of the money gets funneled through shell companies, then transferred to accounts overseas. If we can trace where it's going, we might be able to find a weak spot. Isaiah leaned back, rubbing his temple. We need something more. This is all circumstantial. If we take this to the press now, Keating will spin it, say it's fabricated, and we'll be the ones on the run. Laura shut the laptop. Then we need a witness. Someone who can confirm this isn't just numbers on a screen. Isaiah stared at her, thinking. And then it hit him. There was a man, he said slowly, worked in city planning. He knew about the forced buyouts. Tried to push back against them. Laura's brow furrowed. What happened to him? He disappeared, Isaiah said, the realization sinking in. No one heard from him again. Marcus Hensley paced the length of a small, dimly lit hospital room, his arms crossed tightly. Samantha lay in the bed, her breathing slow but steady. She was awake now, her eyes tracking Isaiah and Laura as they entered. "I've got her under guard," Hensley said quietly. "She'll be safe here." Isaiah nodded in thanks, then turned to Samantha. "You hanging in there?" She gave him a tired smirk. "Been through worse." Isaiah wasn't sure if that was true, but he let it slide. Laura pulled up a chair beside her. "Samantha, we need your help. There was a city employee, a planner who went missing. Do you remember anything about him?" Samantha's brow furrowed. "You mean David Wren?" Isaiah felt something click. "That's the name." She nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember him. He came into the cafe a few times. He was trying to get people to testify, to go on record about the corruption in the city." Laura leaned forward. "What happened to him?" Samantha hesitated. "Last time I saw him, he was scared, kept looking over his shoulder. Said he had to leave town. That was the last I heard." Isaiah and Laura exchanged a look. If David Wren was still alive, he was the key to bringing everything down. Isaiah drove while Laura scanned her phone for any leads on Wren's whereabouts. They had found an old address in the city's employee records, but it was years out of date. As they reached the outskirts of Pinevale, Isaiah's gut tightened. Something felt off. He glanced at the rearview mirror. A black SUV was following them. Laura noticed it too. "That's the third turn they've taken with us." Isaiah's grip on the wheel tightened. "They're not just following us." The SUV suddenly accelerated. Isaiah swerved as a second vehicle cut them off from the front. "Hold on," he warned. The car behind them slammed into their bumper, sending them skidding. Isaiah yanked the wheel, narrowly avoiding a collision, but it was no use. Within seconds, they were surrounded. The doors of the SUVs flew open. Armed men poured out. Isaiah reached for his gun, but it was too late. A hard blow struck the back of his head, and everything went black. Isaiah's head throbbed as he came to, his wrists bound behind him. The cold cement beneath him told him he was somewhere underground. The smell of damp concrete filled the air. A voice echoed through the space. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Isaiah lifted his head, his vision clearing. Mark Redding stood in front of him, arms crossed, a cruel smile on his face. Owen Briggs leaned against the wall, inspecting a knife, his expression bored. Redding crouched down, looking Isaiah in the eyes. "This game is over, Carter." Isaiah stared at him, blood dripping from his forehead, and smiled. "We'll see about that." A dull, throbbing pain spread through Isaiah's skull as he came to. His wrists were bound tightly behind the back of a steel chair, the rope cutting into his skin. The air was thick with dust and oil, the scent of rust lingering in his nose. He blinked, his vision hazy, trying to make out his surroundings. A warehouse, dimly lit, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. Stacks of abandoned crates lined the walls, and the distant hum of passing cars suggested they weren't too far from town. Then he heard it, a slow, deliberate clap. "Well, look who's awake," Mark Redding said, stepping forward, his voice dripping with amusement. "Took you long enough." Isaiah's head lolled slightly, but his mind was already sharpening. He scanned the room. Redding wasn't alone. Two officers stood near the door, both armed, their badges gleaming under the dim light. Briggs leaned against a stack of crates, rolling his shoulders like a man getting ready for a fight. Isaiah exhaled through his nose, forcing his body to relax. He couldn't afford to show them weakness. Redding crouched in front of him, resting an elbow on his knee. "I'll be honest, Carter, you've been a real pain in my ass." Isaiah met his eyes. "Good." Redding smirked. "Yeah, see, I figured you'd say something like that." He gestured toward Briggs. "Go ahead." A fist connected with Isaiah's ribcage. The impact sent a jolt of pain through his body, but he clenched his jaw, refusing to make a sound. Redding sighed dramatically. "I know you're tough, SEAL Team 6 and all that, but even tough guys break." Isaiah's breathing was slow, controlled. He had been through worse. Redding leaned in. "Where's the USB?" Isaiah let a small, defiant smile form. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Redding's expression darkened. Another punch, this time to the face. His head snapped to the side, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. Footsteps echoed through the warehouse. A new voice entered the conversation. Calm, calculated. That's enough, Sergeant. Jonas Keating. The police chief walked in like he owned the place. Hands in the pockets of his tailored overcoat. He moved slowly, like a man who had never rushed for anything in his life. Isaiah lifted his head, blood trickling down his chin. Finally decided to get your hands dirty. Keating? Keating chuckled. Hardly, but I did want to see you before we finished this. Isaiah spat blood onto the floor. Brave of you to show up. Thought you preferred hiding behind your lapdogs. Keating smirked. I make exceptions. He took a slow step forward. See, Isaiah, I run things here, and you? You're a problem. A problem that should have gone away a long time ago. Isaiah held his stare. That's the thing about problems, Keating. If you don't deal with them properly, they tend to come back. Keating's expression didn't change, but there was something colder in his eyes now. That's why I'm making sure this is the last time. He turned to Redding. End it. Redding nodded, motioning to Briggs. Do it. Briggs pulled his gun, stepping forward, aiming straight for Isaiah's head. Isaiah moved. In one swift motion, he twisted his bound wrists, shifting the ropes just enough to loosen them. As Briggs raised his weapon, Isaiah launched himself sideways, tipping the chair violently. The impact shattered the wood, sending him rolling across the floor. The shot rang out, but it missed. Before Briggs could fire again, Isaiah surged forward, grabbing the barrel of the gun and wrenching it to the side. He drove his elbow into Briggs' throat, sending the man stumbling. One of the officers lunged. Isaiah ducked, twisting the gun from Briggs' grip and using it to knock the attacker's legs out from under him. A second shot rang out. Redding's gun. The bullet grazed Isaiah's shoulder, pain flaring instantly. He didn't stop. He turned, firing a clean shot at Redding's hand. The sergeant howled, his gun clattering to the floor. Isaiah's breathing was ragged. Blood dripped from his temple, his shoulder throbbing. But he wasn't done. Keating stood near the door, watching with cold amusement. Impressive, he mused. Isaiah tightened his grip on the gun. Give me a reason, Keating. Keating tilted his head, then sighed. No need. Before Isaiah could react, a sharp crack echoed through the warehouse. Pain exploded in his side. Keating had pulled a gun from his coat and fired. Darkness closed in. The last thing Isaiah heard was Keating's voice, calm as ever. Good night, Carter. Isaiah drifted between consciousness and darkness, the weight of his body feeling foreign, disconnected. The pain in his side pulsed in slow waves, a dull reminder that he was still alive. Voices murmured around him, distant at first, then sharpening. He's coming to, someone said. His eyelids felt heavy, but he forced them open. The first thing he saw was a dimly lit ceiling, rough concrete with exposed pipes running along the edges. He tried to move, but a sharp pain in his ribs stopped him. Easy, Laura's voice said. He turned his head, blinking until her face came into focus. She sat beside him, looking worn but relieved. Where? Isaiah's voice came out rough, his throat dry. You're safe, Laura assured him. Marcus and I got you out before they could finish the job. Isaiah's mind struggled to piece everything together. The warehouse, Redding, Keating, the gunshot. He remembered hitting the ground, the darkness swallowing him. He inhaled sharply, pushing past the pain. Where are we? A safe house, Marcus Hensley said, stepping forward. One of the few places Keating's people haven't compromised. Isaiah forced himself to sit up, wincing. How long? 2 days, Laura said. We had to move you twice to make sure we weren't being followed. Isaiah exhaled, his mind already working. They think I'm dead. Marcus nodded. For now, but that won't last long. Isaiah rubbed his temples. What about the USB? The evidence? Laura's expression turned serious. That's why we need to move fast. News of your disappearance has leaked. People are asking questions. If we come out with the truth now, we can turn the pressure on them before they have time to cover their tracks. Isaiah met her gaze. He had been running, fighting, barely staying ahead. Now, it was time to go on the offensive. The warehouse was packed. It wasn't just reporters. There were business owners, activists, and regular citizens who had come looking for answers. A makeshift stage had been set up at the front, with cameras already rolling. Isaiah adjusted his jacket, hiding the bandages beneath his shirt. The pain was still there, but it didn't matter. Not now. Marcus stood next to him. This is it. Once we do this, there's no going back. Isaiah nodded. Then let's make it count. Laura stepped up to the microphone first, her voice calm but firm. For years, Pinevale has been controlled by corruption. Small businesses threatened, police manipulating the law for their own gain. And the man behind it all? Jonas Keating. The crowd murmured, whispers turning into scattered shouts of agreement. Laura stepped aside, and Isaiah took her place. His gaze swept over the crowd. Some of you know me. Some don't, but I'm standing here today because I refuse to be another name on their list. They tried to silence me. They tried to kill me. And they will keep trying to bury the truth. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket, holding it up, but this time, we have proof. The room erupted in flashes as reporters captured the moment. Laura leaned in. It's already being sent to national outlets. They can't stop it now. Isaiah exhaled slowly. This was what they had fought for. The backlash was immediate. Within hours, protests erupted in Pinevale, people taking to the streets demanding accountability. News stations broadcasted the evidence, linking Keating's operation to real estate fraud, money laundering, and political corruption. The FBI arrived the next morning. Isaiah, Laura, and Marcus watched from a distance as federal agents marched into the Pinevale Police Department, issuing warrants, collecting files. Officers who had once walked around like kings were now being escorted out in handcuffs. Then, finally, Keating, the police chief, stood tall as they led him out, his expression unreadable. Reporters swarmed him, microphones shoved forward. But as he passed Isaiah, he finally spoke. You think this is over? Keating's voice was low, almost amused. You don't even know what you've started. Isaiah stared back, unflinching. Keating smiled. And for the first time since this all began, Isaiah felt a different kind of unease. Keating wasn't bluffing. He still had cards to play. Isaiah sat in the back of the safe house, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the bandage still wrapped around his side. The pain was dull now, a reminder that he was still standing, still fighting. Keating was in federal custody, but Isaiah knew better than to believe it was over. Not yet. Across the room, Laura was on her laptop, eyes scanning through new files the FBI had provided. Marcus stood near the window, watching the street outside like a man who expected trouble. There's something wrong, Laura muttered, tapping at the screen. Isaiah leaned forward. What is it? She exhaled sharply. Keating was too calm when they arrested him. And now, it makes sense. The FBI recovered almost nothing from his office. His accounts are clean. No hard evidence ties him directly to the money laundering. Isaiah frowned. That's impossible. We saw the transactions. Marcus turned from the window. If Keating knew he was going down, he would have burned everything. But that doesn't mean we're out of options. Laura clicked a few more times, then froze. Hold on. Isaiah stood, moving behind her to read over her shoulder. On the screen was a series of encrypted files, the metadata showing they had been deleted just hours before the FBI raid. Someone wiped his records, Laura said, but they missed something. She pulled up a transfer, one that hadn't been deleted in time. A large sum of money had moved out of a shell account controlled by Keating. Not offshore this time, local. Isaiah narrowed his eyes. Who received it? Laura clicked into the details. A name popped up. Jeremiah Vance. Marcus let out a low whistle. Vance is high up, state level. He's got connections all the way to the governor's office. Isaiah's gut tightened. If he's involved, Keating's not just hoping to get out of this. He's already making his move. Laura nodded. And if Keating had a failsafe, Vance is probably covering it up for him. Isaiah rubbed a hand over his jaw. Where does Vance operate? Laura checked another file. There's a private meeting scheduled for tonight. Remote location. Looks like an old development site on the outskirts of town. Isaiah grabbed his jacket. Then we crash it. The development site was a cluster of half-finished buildings, abandoned when funding had mysteriously dried up years ago. Isaiah parked a block away, keeping to the shadows as he approached. Laura had wanted to come, but this wasn't her fight. Not tonight. This was his. He moved carefully, sticking close to the outer walls. A single SUV was parked near the main structure. Its engine still warm. Someone was here. He crept closer, keeping low. Voices carried from inside, muffled but clear enough to make out. "I don't care what it takes," a man said. "Keating's going to walk away from this. Do you understand?" That was Vance. Another voice answered, lower, almost bored. Yeah, don't worry about it. Carter's out of the picture anyway." Isaiah froze. He knew that voice. Mark Redding. His fingers tightened into fists. He had assumed Redding had gone into hiding after Keating's arrest. But no, he was still in play. And worse, he was working to clean up Keating's mess. Isaiah moved closer, pressing against the wall to listen. Vance exhaled sharply. "What about the witness?" A pause. Then Redding chuckled. "Taking care of that tonight." Isaiah's blood ran cold. The witness. The missing government worker. David Wren. Redding wasn't just here to tie up loose ends. He was here to kill Wren before he could testify. Isaiah didn't hesitate. He moved fast, stepping through the side door. Gun raised. The room was a makeshift office. Dimly lit, papers scattered across a folding table. Vance stood near a desk, his phone still in hand. Redding leaned against the wall, lazily twirling a knife between his fingers. Both men turned at the same time. Redding's smile was slow and deliberate. Well, look who's still breathing." Isaiah didn't say a word. He aimed straight at Redding's chest. Vance put his hands up immediately. "Hey, shut up," Isaiah snapped, never taking his eyes off Redding. "Where's Wren?" Redding chuckled, shaking his head. "You really think you're walking out of here alive?" Isaiah stepped closer. "You tell me where he is, or I put you in the ground." Redding's smirk never wavered, but his hand inched toward his gun. Isaiah fired first. The shot hit Redding's shoulder, sending him crashing against the wall. He gritted his teeth, but the smirk was gone now, replaced with pure hatred. Vance flinched, stepping backward. "Wait." Isaiah turned the gun on him. "Where is Wren?" Vance's face was pale, his composure cracking. "He's here. The next building over." Isaiah nodded, then knocked him out with the butt of his gun. The politician crumpled like dead weight. He turned back to Redding, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder. Isaiah took a step closer. "This ends tonight." Redding grinned through the pain. "Then come and get me." Isaiah's grip tightened on the gun, and the final fight began. The air inside the abandoned building was thick with dust, the scent of rotting wood and mildew clinging to every surface. Isaiah moved carefully, his breathing steady despite the pain radiating from his side. The wound from Keating's bullet was slowing him down, but he couldn't afford to stop now. Redding was here, and this time, there would be no escape. A flickering light overhead cast long shadows against the cracked concrete walls. Somewhere in the distance, a loose metal beam creaked in the wind. Isaiah's fingers tightened around the grip of his gun as he advanced deeper into the structure. A voice echoed from the darkness. "You should have stayed dead, Carter." Isaiah turned his head toward the sound, but Redding was moving, keeping to the shadows. "You really think this ends with me?" Redding's voice was laced with amusement. "Keating's just a piece of the puzzle. You think taking me out changes anything?" Isaiah stayed silent, listening. Redding wanted him rattled, off balance, but Isaiah had played this game before. He had hunted men in war zones, dismantled networks of criminals who thought they were untouchable. Redding was dangerous, but predictable. "You were a soldier once, Carter," Redding continued. "You know how this works. Cut off one head, another takes its place." Isaiah moved between the old machinery, careful not to expose himself. "That why you sold your soul? Figured if you couldn't beat the system, you'd profit from it?" Redding laughed, the sound sharp. "Oh, don't act like you're any better. You think people like Keating are the real problem? They're just doing what men in power have always done, taking what they want." Isaiah clenched his jaw. He was done listening. A faint scuffle of boots on concrete. "There." Isaiah turned sharply, firing a shot just as Redding emerged from the shadows. The bullet grazed his shoulder, sending him stumbling back, but Redding was quick, lifting his own gun and firing in return. Isaiah dove behind an overturned workbench, splinters flying as bullets struck the wood. "You're fast," Redding admitted, his voice closer now, "but you're bleeding." And I've got more bullets than you do. Isaiah wiped sweat from his brow, steadying his breath. Redding wasn't wrong. He was running out of time. Then he spotted it, a rusted metal chain dangling from the ceiling, attached to an overhead beam. If he could time it right. Isaiah shifted his position, drawing Redding closer. You know the difference between us? Isaiah called out. Redding scoffed. Enlighten me. Isaiah gripped the chain. I fight to win. He yanked hard. The beam above gave way, crashing down between them. Redding barely had time to react before the dust and debris engulfed him. Isaiah didn't hesitate. He surged forward, slamming Redding's gun away and driving his knee into the man's ribs. Redding grunted, staggering back, but he wasn't done yet. The two men clashed, fists flying, each strike fueled by years of bad blood. Redding fought dirty, elbows, headbutts, anything to get an edge. But Isaiah was patient. He let Redding exhaust himself, dodging just enough to stay standing. Then, when Redding's movements slowed, Isaiah struck. A solid hit to the jaw sent the corrupt sergeant crashing to the ground. Blood dripped from his mouth as he groaned, reaching blindly for his fallen gun. Isaiah kicked it out of reach. Redding coughed, his breath ragged. Go ahead, Carter. Be the executioner. Isaiah stared down at him, gun in hand. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Isaiah holstered his weapon. You're not worth the bullet. Redding let out a low, bitter laugh. You really think this changes anything? Isaiah took a step back. No, but this will. A voice crackled over a hidden radio near Redding's belt. Got everything. Laura's voice came through. He admitted to it all. Redding's face twisted in realization. You. Before he could finish, the sound of sirens filled the air. Isaiah turned toward the entrance just as the FBI stormed the building, agents surrounding them in seconds. Marcus Hensley led the charge, his gun raised. Mark Redding, you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Redding didn't fight. He just sat there, bleeding and beaten, watching as they cuffed him. Isaiah exhaled, his muscles aching, the weight of everything finally settling in. It was over. Hours later, Isaiah stood outside the federal building, watching as the last of the corrupt officers were processed. Keating was among them, his hands cuffed, his face unreadable. As he was led past Isaiah, the former police chief paused just long enough to lean in. You think this is over? Keating murmured. There will always be another man like me. Isaiah met his gaze without flinching. And there will always be someone to stop you. Keating smirked. We'll see. The agents pulled him away. Isaiah watched until the doors closed behind them. Then he turned, walking into the night, knowing this was only the beginning. Isaiah sat in the back of a small cafe, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. The town of Pinevale was unraveling. Its once hidden corruption now dragged into the open. Protests filled the streets, citizens demanding accountability. But Isaiah knew better than to celebrate. Justice wasn't about bringing down one man. It was about dismantling an entire system. And systems didn't go down without a fight. Across from him, Laura scrolled through her phone. Her brows furrowed. More resignations. She murmured. At least 6 officers have been let go. And a few city officials are, voluntarily, stepping down. Isaiah leaned back, crossing his arms. Not good enough. Laura glanced up. It's a start. Isaiah shook his head. They're throwing a few bodies into the fire to make it look like they're cleaning house. But the real players are still out there. Marcus Hensley entered the cafe, his face tense. He slid into the seat beside Laura, lowering his voice. We've got a problem. Isaiah sighed. That's not news. No, Marcus said. This is different. He placed his phone on the table and pressed play on a recording. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. You've done enough. Stop now, or you won't like what happens next. Laura exchanged a look with Marcus. You just got this? Last night, Marcus confirmed. And I'm not the only one. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside were grainy surveillance photos. Laura leaving her apartment. Marcus entering the FBI field office. Isaiah exhaled slowly. They're watching you. And you, Marcus said, handing him another set of photos. Images of Isaiah walking through town, standing outside his store. Laura's expression hardened. They want us scared. Marcus nodded, or silenced. Isaiah's jaw clenched. He had expected retaliation. But this was personal. Later that night, Isaiah drove through the outskirts of Pinevale. His instincts prickling. Someone was following him. He kept his speed steady, watching the headlights in his rearview mirror. When he turned down a side street, the car behind him hesitated, just a second too long. Amateurs. Isaiah pulled over abruptly, stepping out of his vehicle before they had a chance to react. The car rolled to a stop a few feet away. The driver hesitated, then the window lowered. Deputy Marisol Grant. Isaiah raised an eyebrow. Following me now? She glanced around, then leaned forward. Get in. Isaiah studied her for a beat before sliding into the passenger seat. Marisol kept her hands on the wheel, eyes on the road. They're coming for you. Isaiah's stomach tightened. Who? She hesitated. Keating's people, or what's left of them. Isaiah frowned. He's in federal custody. Marisol shook her head. For now, but they're already working on a deal. He's got friends in places higher than Pinevale. If he walks, you'll be their first target. Isaiah exhaled sharply. Let them come. Marisol shot him a look. That's not how this works. They won't come at you with guns. They'll use the law, and they're already making their move. Isaiah's pulse quickened. What do you mean? She hesitated again, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I just came from the station. There's a warrant out for your arrest. Silence filled the car. Isaiah stared at her. For what? Marisol's jaw tightened. Conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and murder. The weight of the words settled between them. Isaiah let out a slow breath, forcing his mind to stay clear. Who did they say I killed? Marisol hesitated. Mark Redding. Isaiah's hands curled into fists. He tried to kill me. Marisol nodded. Doesn't matter. The official report says otherwise. Keating's people knew Redding wouldn't survive this, so they flipped the narrative. Now, you're not the whistleblower. You're the criminal. Isaiah clenched his jaw. He had fought corrupt men before. But this was different. They weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to erase him. Marisol looked at him carefully. What do you want to do? Isaiah turned to face her, his voice steady. I fight back. The courtroom was packed. Rows of wooden benches were filled with reporters, community members, and officers whose badges no longer carried the same weight they once did. The air was heavy, a quiet tension hanging between the walls as the judge took his seat. Isaiah sat beside Laura at the defense table, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. This was exactly what Keating's allies had wanted, to drag him into their system, to turn him from a whistleblower into a criminal. But he wasn't going to let them win. The prosecutor, a state-appointed lawyer with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue, rose from his seat. Your Honor, the case is simple. The defendant, Isaiah Carter, unlawfully engaged in violent acts against law enforcement officers. His reckless actions resulted in the deaths of multiple individuals, including Sergeant Mark Redding. Isaiah's hands clenched into fists under the table. The sheer audacity of their lies was almost laughable. Almost. Laura stood, her voice steady. Your Honor, we intend to prove that my client was the target of an elaborate conspiracy. We have evidence that the charges brought against him are not only false but were fabricated by individuals who are now under federal investigation. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, nodded. Proceed. The trial had begun. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people gathered. Signs were raised high, some with Isaiah's name, others demanding justice for the victims of Pinevale's corrupt police force. The energy was unlike anything the town had ever seen. People who had once been afraid to speak out now stood in unity. Among them was Samantha Green, her arm still in a sling from the injuries she had suffered at the hands of Keating's men. She watched the courtroom doors with determination. She wasn't just here to witness history. She was here to make sure her voice was heard. Back inside, Marcus Hensley took the stand first. He detailed everything: the corrupt transactions, the money laundering, the political connections that had protected Keating and his officers for years. Every word landed like a hammer, chipping away at the case against Isaiah. Then came the recordings. Laura played the audio they had captured from Redding, the confession, the threats, everything. The courtroom sat in silence as the truth played out over the speakers. When the tape ended, Laura turned to the jury. This is the man they are accusing my client of murdering. A man who admitted to orchestrating crimes against the very people he was meant to protect. The prosecutor attempted to object, but the damage had already been done. The final blow came when Samantha Green took the stand. She spoke of the night she was kidnapped, of how she was tortured for refusing to stay silent. Her voice was steady, unwavering. She described how Isaiah had saved her life, how he had risked everything to expose the truth. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. For the first time since the trial had begun, the prosecutor looked uncertain. In the end, the case against Isaiah collapsed under the weight of the truth. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Carter, you are hereby acquitted of all charges. You are free to go." A wave of relief washed over Isaiah, but it was short-lived, because as he glanced toward the gallery, his eyes locked onto someone sitting in the back, Jonas Keating. Despite the orange jumpsuit, despite the shackles around his wrists, Keating looked calm, too calm. As the guards moved to escort him out, Keating leaned toward Isaiah, his voice low enough for only him to hear. "This was never about me," he murmured. "You think you won? You haven't even started fighting the real war." Isaiah watched as Keating was led away, a sick feeling settling in his gut. This wasn't over. It had never been just about Pinevale. It was bigger, and Isaiah knew. Whoever was really pulling the strings, they were still out there. The prison gates slammed shut behind Jonas Keating, but Isaiah knew better than to think that was the end of it. The headlines ran with the story. Corrupt police chief sentenced to 25 years, but the real news wasn't in what had happened. It was in what was still to come. Keating had cut a deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he had handed over a list of names, officials, politicians, law enforcement higher-ups, people who had helped protect him, who had benefited from the same system of corruption he had built in Pinevale. The FBI was running point on the new investigation, but Isaiah had no illusions. Some of those names would be taken down, others would walk away untouched. Justice had its limits when the system itself was compromised. Laura had warned him. "We've exposed them, Isaiah, but we haven't broken them. This goes beyond Pinevale. This is national." He believed her, and that was the part that kept him up at night. The police department was in shambles. Federal oversight had led to mass terminations, internal investigations, and a complete restructuring of leadership. But not everyone who deserved to be punished was facing consequences. Some officers had resigned before they could be fired, taking quiet deals that let them walk away clean. Others had simply been reassigned, moved to new departments where their records wouldn't follow. The system protected its own. Marcus Hensley had paid the price for his involvement, though not in the way he deserved. He wasn't fired or arrested, but he was removed from Pinevale, reassigned to a low-profile post in another state. Officially, it was a promotion. Unofficially, it was a way to silence him, to push him aside so he wouldn't stir up any more trouble. When Isaiah met him for a drink before he left town, Marcus had shrugged. "They don't like loose ends, Carter. They want things to go back to the way they were." Isaiah had taken a sip of his whiskey. "Are you gonna let them?" Marcus had given him a tired smirk. "Not a chance." Laura Weston had come out of this as a rising star. The case had catapulted her into the national spotlight, turning her into a sought-after lawyer for civil rights cases. But she wasn't celebrating. As they sat in her office a week after the trial, she leaned forward, fingers steepled. "This isn't over." Isaiah nodded. "I know. They're going to push back harder than ever. You embarrassed them. You exposed them. And people like that? They don't forget." Isaiah exhaled. "I'm not looking for another fight, Laura." She gave him a knowing look. "You don't have a choice." The store felt different when Isaiah stepped back inside. The shelves were stocked. The glass windows had been replaced. But something had shifted. The town itself had changed. People didn't flinch when a police cruiser rolled by. They didn't lower their heads when walking past city officials. Pinevale had spent too long living under the weight of corruption. And now that weight had been lifted, even if only partially. Isaiah ran his fingers over the wooden counter, feeling the grain beneath his fingertips. He had fought for this. And he had won. For now. That night, as he locked up, he saw the envelope. It had been slipped under the door. A plain white envelope with no return address. Isaiah picked it up, his gut already telling him it wasn't a thank you letter. He opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper. A list of names. Names he didn't recognize. But he knew exactly what it meant. The fight wasn't over. It had never been about just Pinevale. Someone out there wanted him to keep going. Isaiah folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his pocket. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. Isaiah stood outside his store, hands in his pockets, watching as life in Pinevale slowly reshaped itself. The town was different now, not perfect, but change. People walked a little taller. They met the eyes of passing officers without fear. The police still patrolled the streets, but their presence no longer carried the quiet threat it once did. He spotted Marisol Grant near the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters. The news of her promotion had spread fast. One of the first female officers in Pinevale to openly stand against corruption and survive the fallout. She handled the cameras with steady confidence, her words measured but firm. "This town deserves officers who serve, not control," she said. "We have a long way to go, but we're not going back to the way things were." Isaiah allowed himself a small smile. If there were more like her, maybe the fight had been worth it. Inside the store, the scent of aged wood and fresh coffee filled the air. Laura sat at the counter, a case file open in front of her. Marcus leaned against the shelves, arms crossed, listening as she talked through their next steps. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low. "Keating was a symptom, not the disease." Marcus nodded. "We need to follow the money." The names he gave up were just the surface. Isaiah pulled up a chair. "We hit them where it hurts. Make sure they know someone's still watching." Laura studied him for a long moment. "You don't have to stay, Isaiah." He met her gaze. "Yeah, I do." For the first time in a long while, he knew exactly where he was meant to be. As the sun dipped behind the buildings, Isaiah locked up for the night. That's when he saw it. A black sedan parked just down the street, its engine still running. They weren't done watching him. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Let them watch. He wasn't going anywhere. As he turned back toward the store, a passerby nodded to him in quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't just respect, it was understanding. This fight wasn't just his. It belonged to all of them. The screen fades to black. A single line appears. "Justice doesn't come from the system. It comes from those who refuse to back down." Corruption thrives in silence. But what happens when someone refuses to look away? Isaiah Carter didn't set out to be a hero. He was just a man who stood his ground. But sometimes, that's all it takes to spark change. His fight wasn't just about exposing one corrupt officer or taking down a single crime ring. It was about proving that no system is untouchable when people dare to challenge it. So, what would you do if the truth put a target on your back? Would you walk away, or would you stand and fight? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths, because the fight for justice is far from over.